All right, so good afternoon, good morning, whatever time of day it is for you guys, my Euro class. I hope you're all doing well. I hope your health is staying well. Um, Today, what I want us to do is continue our discussion about the Russian Revolution and really see that revolution come into effect. And so World War I is really a critical moment for this event. But I want to start with this image that you're looking at in the front. What this is, what you're seeing here is Tsar Nicholas on his horse holding an icon, and then soldiers on the front kneeling before it in prayer. The Tsar was a religious figure. He was leading the helm, and World War I, in a lot of ways, really helped him in the beginnings strengthen and centralize his rule. And there was actually a lot of potential. A lot of the revolutionaries were disappointed with the war because there was a wave of nationalism that was found throughout all of Russia and really supporting the Tsar along with religious fervor towards the war, right? Sort of these blessings. But as the war continued to go on, that very war that seemed like it was a great opportunity for the Tsar to sort of restart his reign, solidify his rule, gain popular support among the commoners, causes a real shift in power. And in the end, World War I is just exacerbating long-term problems of political stagnation, social inequality, incomplete industrialization, food and land distribution, all while creating support for revolutionary change. Pretty much in a time of total war, those countries that are able to mobilize for the war effort successfully are going to be successful. Those who fail to mobilize their people to get the loyalty of all of their people in their empire ready to go and fighting for that war are going to suffer huge losses. And so in Russia in particular, you have many different pockets within this empire that are not going to be supporting the war effort and not cooperating with the Tsar. And this lack of cooperation, this lack of a mindset of a patriotic spirit and calling for the war effort is going to undermine the Tsar's efforts. You have fragments of groups such as national minorities, groups like people living in Ukraine or people who identify themselves as Polish who are under the Russian Empire who don't feel any kind of loyalty to the Tsar or any need to fight and die for his behalf. The socialists, all the many different socialist parties that we were discussing, they too are not going to be very cooperative with this. They're going to take real issue with the war itself. In particular, there's a split here, even more so, between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks at least still view national identity and will ascribe themselves to the Russian country. Bolsheviks were internationalists. And so this war, any war, made no sense to them because nationalities should be a moot point. And so they were calling more for cooperation across countries, and they were viewed as a threat to the war effort. Working men and peasants are going to be fighting this war with little conviction, and there's a stark difference in class between the ordinary foot soldier and then the officers who are from the elite. And the officers are going to be treating those soldiers and talking to them as if they're serfs again. And there's no real respect for them or any opportunities for them to move up the ranks. It's really still two different classes there. And so for the ordinary factory worker or peasant, this war seems just meaningless. As they're going off to the war front, it's pretty much a death sentence for them. And they recognize that, and it's a frustration for them as well. The middle class in general are going to cooperate in this war effort because it does offer them opportunities for their businesses to grow and for industrialization. They're hoping, though, that this war is also going to help strengthen those liberal policies that the Tsar had created. So things like the Duma, the Constitution, they wanted to be strengthened and sort of more concretely created. But there were glaring government mismanagements, along with military disasters in 1914, 1915, that are going to make some of the middle class quite reluctant to be joining in this war effort and causing them to be upset. In addition to that, you do have the provincial Zemstvos organizing to help mobilize agriculture and industry. So you do see in the peasant class some cooperation, and business groups are going to be forming to help get maximum cooperation in production of goods. So middle class then gets a sense of strength as well as importance in their day-to-day life, because now they're critical factors for this war effort is their industry and their factories that they're running. That privileged position also allows them to be more critical openly of the bureaucracy. And that's not just for the middle class. In order to get the cooperation of all classes in Russia at this time, the Tsar is going to need to get the support of many different groups. And so there is going to be sort of a loosening of the restrictions on speech and ideas. And so some of those more radical pockets of thought that had been suppressed are now going to be allowed to meet and gather again, because there's so many other things going on that are priorities for the Tsar other than that. Now, while World War I is one factor in the actual Russian Revolution, another one that I can't downplay, although historians, sort of a fun thing for historians to dwell about, he is a relevant part of the story, true history, is this man, Rasputin. I always like to start with, would you trust your children with this man? I wouldn't. And I hope you wouldn't either. Just look by looks. I know that's cruel of me, but look at him. I don't know. But Rasputin himself. So a little bit of background on who he is. I know you might know the song "Ra Ra Rasputin." Okay, anyway, sorry if I got that stuck in your head now. But Rasputin himself. He was from Siberia. He was supposedly a priest from the Eastern Orthodox Church. He claimed that descent, although he never had any papers to prove it. The Tsarina Alexandra was really the one who was most tied to Rasputin, viewed him as a really important figure for the Russian peace because he was able to save her son. Rasputin was a critical figure, for a cause for this Russian Revolution. He caused a lot of the distrust, or he was the source for a lot of the distrust between the Tsar and his people. He became a symbol for them of this mismanagement, of this corruption, of this sickness that is infiltrating the Tsars, that we can no longer support this institution. The third and fourth Dumas are actually both going to be dismissed by the Tsar as they were trying to pass legislation to remove Rasputin from his position in the Tsar's household. That was the law that was being passed at the time that made them get closed, because they had critical attitudes towards Rasputin and towards the conduct of the war itself. He had a lot of access to the Tsar and Tsarina, granted to him by the Tsarina because of Alexei, their son who suffered from hemophilia. But this control and access could not be known to the people, to the general public. The general public were not made aware that Alexei had hemophilia. And so instead, what it appeared like was this peasant from the middle of nowhere is living in the palace and corrupting the minds of the Tsar and Tsarina, and he's really the ruler at this time. And so this is creating greater separation between the Tsar and his people and his own government, because he's not listening to anyone if Rasputin disagrees with that judgment. So this is all going to then, those two factors, World War I and Rasputin, really are the big ones right now, are going to come to a head by February of 1917. By this point, Russia was in true crisis. The people were starving. There was no food. Food was so scarce. There were no price controls or rationing. In Russia, they didn't organize it in that way. So it really greater highlighted the differences in wealth when there was no price controls and the poor just couldn't afford food anymore. And so there were food riots throughout early period of February, culminating to a major food riot led by women. The date in our calendar, you have to remember that Russia at the time was using a different calendar, would be March 8th. And on March 8th, women organized a general strike throughout all of Petrograd, which was St. Petersburg, demanding for food and reforms from the Tsar to provide more food. And then this escalated into insurrection, which the army in the end refused to suppress. Within Petrograd itself, there was actually about 150,000 army troops present, but they were mainly the new recruits who would not fire upon their moms and their girlfriends and their aunts, right? They're not going to get involved in that way. And so they joined the demonstrators on March 10th. And with that, we end up seeing the overturn of the Tsar, and he's going to have to be stepping down. Just as a note before we go any further, so March 8th, as I mentioned, is our Western calendar date. That date today now is celebrated to be International Women's Day. It's used as a date to mark this first time, this moment in time when women take to the streets and demand their rights. Now, International Women's Day in the United States is a fairly new holiday. It's definitely not something that we do too much for. There's a Google Doodle for it, and Old Navy sells t-shirts for that day. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those. But worldwide, it is a global celebration that has its roots in 1917. But only countries that were communist celebrated International Women's Day until maybe about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's a relatively new holiday to be embraced by Western countries. And they only did so gradually as they were adopting, as the threat of the Soviet Union has died away. Now, back to the story, right? So when the army joins and the Tsar loses his complete power, he's going to need to abdicate. Now, while that's going on, the Tsar is actually on the front while this is going on, and he's on a train. So he's unable to properly communicate with his government. And so instead, the government itself starts to self-manage. And what you end up seeing are two governments at once in Petrograd. There is the provisional government, led by more progressive, moderate people, right? And they're going to be very similar to the Third Estate tennis court oath group during the French Revolution, right? They are going to be a provisional government supported by a man in particular named Alexander Kerensky, and it's trying to be a moderate power. While at the same time, there's another group that's being formed, the Soviets. Now, I've mentioned these Soviets before. The Soviets are these political groups of workers, similar to labor unions. It's often grounded based in your factory. And they're similar to like the clubs of France during the French Revolution, like the Jacobin Club and the other political clubs that were formed that originally were created from the 1905 revolutions. Well, a Soviet of workers and soldier deputies was formed in Petrograd at the same time as this provisional government. And it became the center for working class upheaval, and the working class followed them as their government. So the two governments actually were meeting in the same palace. And Kerensky, it was Kerensky's job, this just seems so absurd, but Kerensky's job was to run back and forth between the two and try and get them to agree to certain provisions and groups, because depending on who you were in Russia, you're either going to listen to one government or the other. And they both were having very different demands. And there were many times where on purpose, a bill passed in one of the groups would then be turned down or overturned by the other. And so you just see this constant back and forth between the two, just sheer chaos. And this was the provisional government. By March of 1917, Russia's in complete turmoil. And it's known as the February Revolution. Now, Nicholas arrives trying to return, but the army is stopping his train. He then has to abdicate, recognizing that the army is no longer supporting his efforts. And he offers the throne to his brother. He tries to get his brother to take on the tsardom rather than put Alexei in power, because he knows something about Alexei that the rest of the public doesn't. However, his brother refuses the throne. And with that, Russia then will just become a republic. Sort of happens quite quickly. And that this new government, whatever it is, quite the mess that it is, will be granting amnesty to all exiles. And so with that, you end up having Vladimir Lenin, who was an exile from Russia, who had been kicked out and been living in Switzerland at the time, returning from Zurich in April of 1917. Now, when Lenin returns, he's actually brought there by Germany. Germany puts him on an armored car, a sealed armored car, and ships him straight through a nonstop train straight through Germany. And the major reason why was, yes, the Germans wanted Lenin to influence this new Russia, right, this new Russian Republic, and convince them to become communist and to pull out of the war. At the same time, the German government wanted nothing to do with Lenin himself, because he was just as much of a threat to them as he would have been to the Russian war effort as well. Now, this new provisional government really struggles, and here you're seeing Kerensky overseeing the troops. The provisional government was really an extension from the Duma, and so there was an association with this provisional government with the failure of the Tsar. And one of the big things that they did is they maintained all of their international commitments in the war effort. While that's going on, though, armies are deserting left and right. They're pulling out. They're under-equipped. But the Bolsheviks keep promising them peace, land, and bread. It sort of becomes a constant refrain by the Bolshevik Party. And for the soldiers, they're like, well, why am I waiting? You know, I might as well just leave, go home. I'm going to die one way or another. If I'm a deserter, I'm going to be killed. And if I stay here, I'll die. I might as well take my chances and die at home. The government also, Kerensky's government, is refusing to let peasants seize any land. And so therefore, people are still starving, and they're not able to solve those food problems. There's also the threat of a bunch of military coups, different coups from different militaries. So the Soviets themselves are starting to form a paramilitary group called the Red Army, their own private military group with a lot of the deserting army soldiers. There's also those who support the Tsar, the conservative wave. They also have a military group that they're trying to topple the government. And then there's also just a military branch that wants to have their own person in charge during this time of war. And so there's actually plots by a few different generals trying to overtake the government at this time. So it's just all chaos. You can just imagine all of these things. The provisional government cannot maintain control. So when Lenin does arrive in April, he promises 3 simple things in a famous speech he calls the April Thesis: peace, land, and bread. And I'm going to be posting a video from a cartoon I watched as a child that is fantastic. And I can't emphasize it more enough. It will just be a happy little moment in your life. It's no more than 3 minutes. Please watch it. You'll get a little glimpse of my very strange childhood when you do so. But in this promise of peace, land, and bread, he's promising the end of war, to give land to the peasants who tilled it, to give socialist ownership of the means of production, and recognition of the Soviets as the government. And so he's doing this to really appeal to, remember, there were sort of 2 governments at once in this February Revolution. He's pulling the power in Petrograd to the Soviets, and he's trying to give them the power, but also help them convert to the Bolshevik Party in the Bolshevik way. So the Bolsheviks at this time are quite a small minority in Russia. They're not a large group. They don't have widespread support, but he's able to sort of gain these different types of supports. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk about Lenin's revision of Marxism. The Russian Revolution is creating a regime based on Marxism, right? We do identify that the Russian Revolution creates a communist country, but I think we're all very aware that communism of the Soviet Union is nothing like what Marx had been portraying. So I want to just point out some of the ways that the Russian Revolution is going to corrupt, or how Lenin's own philosophies shift some of the ideas of Marx, where we'll never call the Russian system, or really any other communist system today, a true Marxist system, but instead a Marxist-Leninist system. So where Marx had argued that revolution should be done by the working class in a mass uprising, right? That where it's the final stage of capitalism when all the workers of the world unite together and uprise. Instead, for Lenin, he said that there's going to need to be a vanguard, a bourgeois intelligentsia, who are going to be able to bring a socialist consciousness to the working class. So there needs to be an elite that are going to be leading this group. For Marx, it's a democratic movement, right? Widespread, everyone's joining together. For Lenin, he does not believe that the working class will ever be able to have that same kind of leadership ability or to be able to join. And instead of it being a spontaneous movement, as Marx had argued, that there's no need for intervention by people outside of the working class, Lenin said there must be a leadership group, and that there needs to be a dictatorship of the proletariat was his mindset. Rather than having the government just wither away, we're going to have this elite group leading the proletariat. And over time, his phrase, dictatorship of the proletariat, is going to get even more corrupted once we get to Stalin. And he's really centralizes his control and his power there. One final just note, Marx hated espionage, right? He was one who advocated for really to free the people from exploitation of their status, right? To sort of create this classless society where everyone's respecting rights and, you say what you will about it, but very much trying to represent and, protect these rights. And Lenin, on the other hand, he's in favor of using the secret police. He was in favor of, killing people, mass shootings if you disagreed with him. Once he's in power, very quickly we see a lot of human rights abuses there. For Lenin, the ends justify the means at all cost. And so we see this distinction here, which is going to be creating a bit of challenge. Now, throughout the summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks appealed effectively to the workers and soldiers of Petrograd, increasing their popular support, and by October, the Bolsheviks are able to gain a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. And so with that, Lenin, along with Trotsky, his right-hand man, are going to be leading the October Revolution. Some people describe it as a coup. Others describe it as a mass uprising, a true revolution. And that's one thing I want us to sort of discuss and debate, what was that event? And so we'll be looking at some documents for that. But the October Revolution itself, it was a military and worker insurrection aided by the revived Soviets as they're getting more power. And they're undermining the provisional government, setting the stage for Lenin's long-planned Bolshevik revolution and the establishment of a communist state. The actual October Revolution had fewer people died in that revolution than even the February Revolution prior, definitely before, less than the 1905. It was sort of a moment that lots changed without people being aware that a lot changed. And so daily life very much in Petrograd and St. Petersburg felt the same. But very quickly in that period of time, in the October Revolution, which is occurring in November of 1917, a lot is going to start to change. So the Bolsheviks, having that majority in the Soviets, saw the time was right for their action. And with the support of key army and navy units, the Bolsheviks on the night of November 6th will capture telephone exchanges, railroad stations, and electric lighting plants, and warships are going to turn its guns onto the Winter Palace. And so with that, the Congress of Soviets will oust the Duma and replace it with the Council of People's Commissars, headed by Lenin and Trotsky as Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and Stalin actually is present there as the Commissar for Nationalities. Lenin is going to therefore announce 2 resolutions calling for an end to the war without annexations, without indemnities, and abolishing the landlord properties. When the Constituent Assembly finally met, it was adjourned by the armed Bolsheviks. The dictatorship of the proletariat therefore had begun. And so very quickly, Lenin is seizing power and he's calling for peace. Now, this is going to create quite some different challenges for us. And so immediately, pretty much, this new regime is going to fall into a civil war. And the first thing that Lenin feels obligated to do would be to make treaty with Germany, right, and create peace. And so they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk is spelled Brest-Litovsk. And this is a treaty made with Germany, and it was under the assumption that the proletarian revolution would soon break out throughout all of Russia, throughout all of Europe. Lenin was very confident that that would be the move. And if you look at this map, this black line that's being seen, this is all the land that Russia was willing to give up in exchange for peace with Germany and end of the war. When we look at the Treaty of Versailles, then all of those new countries that were created as buffers between Germany and the Soviet Union were really former parts of the Russian Empire. And just as an aside, this entire Russian Revolution, one big factor of this is, or one big question is, the unity of the Russian Empire. Russia's massive, with many different languages, many different cultures, many different peoples, all of whom wanted to have their own nationalism, their own identity, and they viewed that the fall of the Tsar was that opportunity. And so Lenin justifies a lot of his more extreme and harsh actions as an argument saying Russia needs to stay strong. We need to stay strong. These groups can't leave us. And to sort of bring in groups. And Stalin, who was from the Caucasus, he was a Georgian descent. There was a big Georgian nationalist uprising. Stalin himself actually steps in and squashes that. He said he's the one who oversees putting down that nationalist uprising. But nationalism is another factor of this Russian Revolution that we're not even going to go deep into. But just to know that that's another thing that's going on that's breaking apart these Soviet states. Lenin was someone who wanted people to have self-determination in a way, but once he's in power, he realizes he has to go back on that call. At any rate, once Russia is out of World War I, they've lost a lot of areas of land. The Baltic states, Ukraine, and Poland. Germany is actually already occupying a lot of these lands, but they're gaining new lands as well. Russia then falls into a civil war. And it's Trotsky who's leading the Red Army. It's led by the Soviets versus the White Army, who's everybody else. The White Army is made up of bourgeois liberals, the Zemstovs, the men from the Zemstovs, those peasant groups, the Mensheviks, the more moderate Republicans, along with people who supported the Tsar, the conservatives. These groups are all actually going to be obtaining a lot of aid from the Allies with the hope that they'll be able to renew the fighting on the Eastern Front. Japan actually occupies Siberia until 1922. They're just present there. England, France, and the United States are all active during this civil war. And so when you wonder why is it that, we so quickly fell into the Cold War, the roots of the United States and Soviet Union antagonisms go right back to here from its foundations, right? We were against the formation of the Soviet Union from the get-go and actively trying to fight against it. In order to defeat this war, it seems like a war that the Red Army shouldn't win, right? It's a brand new group, not even widespread popularity across everybody, and yet they are able to defeat the White Army, which was everybody else. And some of the reasons why, one big reason is just the strategic location of where the Red Army was. The Red Army held the central area and everyone else had to invade from the outside. In addition to that, the rest of Europe is still fighting in World War I, so they're not able to dedicate all of their resources here and all their troops. But another big reason is that Lenin, unlike the Tsar, was actually able to act in times of war and mobilize in terms of total war in a much more effective way. And so one example of this is the creation of war communism. In order to feed the people, Lenin does extreme acts where he is going to have a collection of different emergency measures and a very militant-based communism. And so some of the steps that happen, there's the formation of the Cheka. Immediately there's the secret police. There's the political police. It's the predecessor to the KGB that you might be more familiar with, making sure that no one within the areas of his control survive to live another day if they disagree with Lenin's ideas. There's also a name change. Instead of being the Bolshevik Party, now they are going to be the Russian Communist Party. The capital will move to Moscow rather than St. Petersburg, Petrograd, which was the capital of the Tsar. Now he's going to be in the center of Moscow, the heartland of Russia, the Russian identity there. Any other political parties are not going to be allowed to exist. The Communist Party is going to be controlling the state and nationalize the production of all goods. There will no longer be any form of private land. They'll also nationalize the industry. Strikes will be made illegal. The church and state will be firmly separated, and church lands will be seized. Banks will be seized. Railroads will be seized. Any big industries will be seized by the government. Opposition is immediately oppressed. And there's a big wave of red terror, where it's a campaign to exterminate the bourgeois opponents and even leftist deviations, anyone who disagrees with the party line, the Communist Party line. The human toll between World War I, the Civil War, another 7 million people are going to be dying during the Civil War because of famine or the war itself. Just enormous losses. And Lenin is really fine with doing mass executions. So what he's doing is clearing the state for his new society. Now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks do win the Civil War. Strategically, they controlled the center while the whites were always on the fringes and disunited. The general of the White Army refused to call for a democratic republic and a federation of nationalities, because he would rather see the Tsar come back into power. So even though he knew that would help his cause, he wasn't willing to make that declaration. The communists also had a better army. In March of 1918, Trotsky, as the war commissar, reestablished the draft and had really drastic discipline for the newly formed Red Army. If you disobeyed in any way, from, not standing straight enough, you could be summarily shot right then on the spot. And this war communism, total war kind of group applied to the civilians as well. They're going to be seizing grain from the peasants, introducing rationing, which was something the Tsar never introduced during the entire World War, and nationalize all the banks and industry, requiring everyone to work. Those things helped mobilize and provide the resources needed for war. That does not mean it went without cost. I mean, many people died of starvation. War communism was terrible for the economy. They ultimately were underproducing goods, but it was a way for Lenin to be able to address these problems. The foreign military intervention in many ways might have actually helped the communists rather than hurt them, because after Lenin made peace with Germany, the Allies, Americans, British, and Japanese, are sending troops in to prevent the war material they had been lending to the provisional government to be captured by the Germans. They start to allow for the communists to appeal to patriotic nationalism in a new way, right? How are we letting these foreigners invade our country and seize our military weapons, right? For the patriotic cause, it helps centralize Lenin's rule, and he's able to use that propaganda to further help him. Now, all of these stresses of total war are really going to be the things that will be a challenge, and it will create a lot of different difficulties. Now, Lenin, after the Civil War is over, is going to need to sort of have everyone take a breath and form a better economy and a better state. And so he's going to shift from the war communism policy to the new economic policy, which allows for some capitalism. And this new economic policy goes from 1921 to 1927, which is when Lenin passes away. War communism led to famine, mass deaths. It's estimated 4 to 5 million people died of that famine alone. And so Lenin agrees that it's okay to take one step backward in order to later take 2 steps forward. And so if you can see here, right, originally under war communism, if you worked really hard, you got up every morning and you grew 10 tons of grain, the government would take all your surplus. And so 9 tons would be taken away from you and you'd be left with just 1 ton. Meanwhile, if you grew 1 ton of grain, the government wouldn't take any from you. You'd still be left with that 1 ton. This new economic policy, it was allow peasants to sell farm produce that was extra. So if you grew that 10, the government's only taking 50%, you're still left with your 1 ton plus a profit you can still sell. Middlemen could then buy and sell these goods and city products at market prices. Private trading for profit was encouraged under this new economic plan. In the end, the kulak class, that landed peasant class, they're going to be prospering the most through this, and they really start to flourish and grow. And by 1928, Russia had amazingly returned to the conditions of 1914. Its economy had stabilized and started to really work with these free market principles. In terms of the government, and this is under Stalin, but this structure is actually, I like this image a lot, and so I'm going to talk about it in terms of, this is how the Soviet Union itself was organized. It's a federal republic. So the Soviet Union is made up of a republic in order to solve the problem of the 100 different languages spoken in the Soviet Union, along with the 50 distinct nationalities. So each of these different republics is given cultural autonomy. You can speak the language that you want in this area. You can sort of share a common culture. And it's organized by size. And so there's different districts and regions, the republics within the federated Soviet republics themselves. In 1936, the constitution that's made, and this is under Stalin, creates a Soviet of nationalities with representatives from each of the different areas. Russia remains distinctly Slavic. And Great Russians representing about half of the people and 3/4 of the territory of the entire Soviet Union. The Ukrainians and Belarusians were the two other largest parts of this group. The real power, though, remained within the party, and any major minority grievances were left completely unresolved and just completely ignored. All citizens were given the right to vote, men and women. And within the state itself, you have the basic unit was your council or your Soviet. And each town chose a Soviet, which elected then delegates to a provisional Soviet, which then elected to the Republic, then elected to a national Soviet of the Union. The key group was the Council of Ministers held by the Premier or the Politburo. This was a 95-man cabinet, and they supervised the economy and controlled the state bureaucracy. The party itself was headed by the Central Committee. The Central Committee was composed of a secretariat who had organizational matters and sort of organized the system. The Politburo that was headed by the General Chairman. And the party itself, so sort of separate from all of this, was the party itself, the Communist Party. And that Communist Party is going to be really setting the policy, the originality, boldness, freedom of thought, was all strictly curtailed, right? The party itself was the one that set the policies that then was enforced by this structure that we're looking at here. Discipline was provided by the secret police, and the party remained a relatively small disciplined group. Only about 5% of the citizens were party members. Now, all of these people, from the party to the Politburo, to the Soviet nationality, the Soviet Union, local Soviets, and the people themselves, respond to one leader. And in the case of after Lenin's death, it will be Stalin. And Stalin will be the head of the party as well as the head of the government. And so really, when we say the idea that the party is a small group that, sets the policy, that party is really set by Stalin himself. And that's how he's able to become this totalitarian leader. So Lenin's going to die in 1924, and in between 1924 and 1927, there's a question of who's going to be taking on the leadership in the Soviet Union. Trotsky is one. He is going to be disliking the new economic plan, and he represents the left. He wants to spread the revolution, promote industrialization, and continue more of the communist cause. To the right of the party are people who are more conservative, right? They are happy to keep the new economic policy. They say, it's helping strengthen the Soviet Union first. Let's stop spreading the revolution until we are under better control here. And then Stalin, who's not really standing for anything. And he's just sort of standing in the middle there, using it as an opportunity to centralize his own power. Sorry, so here's the death of Lenin, and everyone's stopping to see his body. His body will never be buried. It's actually still preserved in what was formerly Red Square, at least up until the 80s. If you ever have Mr. Orfeh as a sub, you'll be able to ask him about what it was like to go and visit the body in this museum. It was preserved. It's still available. I don't believe it's in the Red Square anymore. I'm not sure where his body is now. But with that, we have Stalin coming into power. For Stalin's opinion, right, some quotes from him: death solves all problems, no man, no problem. Education is a weapon whose effect depends on who holds it in his hands and at whom it is aimed. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his army can reach. Gaiety is the most outstanding feature of the Soviet Union. Gaiety. And gratitude is a sickness suffered by dogs. Okay. And with this, I'm going to stop. We're going to talk about Stalin. He is going to acquire a lot of different supporters because of his position in the Secretariat. He's actually able to appoint his supporters. About 10,000 in the end are built into the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union, so that he's able to gradually just seize power for himself and centralize it under himself. And Trotsky's actually forced to flee to Mexico, of all places, where he will be found killed with a pickaxe into his neck. With that, I will stop for the day. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'm sorry it went a bit long, but with that, we have now covered the whole Russian Revolution. And so what I'm going to ask that you do is read some documents that will help you argue whether or not it was a coup, a military coup or not, the November Revolution. And then next week we'll compare the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution. All right, take care. All my best. Bye.